Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining our question time webinar, which is on addressing common challenges in evaluation. Before we get started with the presentation, I just have a few housekeeping points to run through. Firstly, it's webinar format, so you're all automatically muted and your videos are off. Any questions you have, please do submit them throughout the session. And make sure that they are in the Q&A function. If you submit via chat, then there's a possibility that we won't see them and we won't be able to answer the question. The webinar is set to run until 11:30, and there's plenty of time at the end for questions. But there may be a chance that we will finish early. I'd also like to let you know that we are recording the session and we distribute the recording and presentation slides to attendees afterwards. And we'd also love to hear your feedback, so please do keep an eye open for a post-event survey, which will be dropping into your inbox over the coming days. So I'm Helen Lawson, TESO's Research Programs Manager, and facilitating today's webinar and presenting today our RAIN, our Evaluation Manager, and Zara, our Research Officer. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to RAIN.
Super, thank you, Helen. So yeah, welcome everyone. Great to have so many of you here. As Helen has outlined, today's session is basically an opportunity for us to kind of unpick some of the common challenges in evaluation, or more specifically, I guess, some of the common challenges or questions that we get asked. And we've kind of split the session in 50-50. So we have had people send through questions over the last kind of week or 10 days. And we've got a couple of slides prepared, nothing too fancy or formal based on those questions. So we'll start with that, and then we'll have lots of time at the end for kind of a more live Q&A. So do just drop your questions in the chat box as you go. New questions related to the ones that we're going to be outlining and answering. We'll have time to come to it all, hopefully. Before we kick off with our questions, and Zara and I are going to do a bit of a kind of back and forth ping pong format, but a quick intro to TESO. I think this is probably quite a familiar slide to many of you now. But as you can see on screen, we are an independent hub for HE professionals. So our kind of key mission is to help upskill and build capacity to conduct evaluation and research within the HE sector. And we do that by producing kind of guidance, toolkits, information, and also more kind of dialogue like this. So working directly with the sector to help unpick and untangle key issues. We are an independent charity, so we were set up as a consortium by King's College, the Behavioural Insights team, and Nottingham Trent University. It's actually our first birthday today, post spin out a year ago. So just getting started as our kind of independent charity status. We are also an affiliate What Works Centre. So there's a number of these centres that support the government with producing the kind of best quality causal evidence to be able to inform policy. We're obviously focused on HE, but some of the other centres, the EEF is focused on education in kind of primary and secondary schools. There's one for homelessness, there's one for children's social care. So a number of these What Works centres that pull together to produce better quality evidence. And then finally, you can see at the bottom here, we're funded by the Office for Students. So at the moment, they are our kind of key and primary funder, but we are independent from the OFS and an independent charity. So not tied to the regulator in any big way. A quick reminder of our kind of mission and vision. So our vision is to eliminate equality gaps in higher education, and our mission is to improve lives through evidence-based practice. And of course, evaluation, and the topic of today's webinar, kind of is a key foundation or underpins both our vision and mission. So to get us straight into the questions and the detail, we've tried to kind of categorize the questions that came through in advance under key stages of evaluation. So the first thing to talk through is understanding the different standards of evidence that we often talk about. And I am going to hand over to Zara to answer this.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So I'm going to start with the first question that we very commonly get, which is, what does type 1, type 2, and type 3 evidence mean? So we often use this slide when we want to talk about evaluation and why we need to conduct more type 3 evidence, research or evaluation. So our evaluation of the evidence that currently exists in the sector is that we have enough good type 1 evidence, what we call narrative evidence. We have some type 2 evidence, which is empirical inquiry, but we are still missing a lot of type 3 evidence, which is causal evidence. And that's what we say, like, there's a missing piece of the puzzle. So what does that really mean? Well, TESO follows the guidelines of the OFS in terms of standards of evidence, which means that type 1 evidence, so narrative evidence, it means that there's a narrative to why we would expect an activity to be effective. And usually this narrative is based on the finding from other research or evaluation. And the tool that is most used under this type of evidence is theory of change. So you certainly know about it. When it comes to type 2 evidence, or what we call empirical inquiry, it means that there is data to suggest that the activity is associated with better outcome for students. In practice, usually it's the type of analysis that estimates correlation between an activity and some outcomes. But type 3 evidence, which is causal evidence, as I said before, we don't have enough of, and it's an evidence that demonstrates not just correlations, but causality, so causal impact, which means that we know that the activity has a causal impact on the outcome of students. So at TESO, what we really want to do, as Rain said just before, is understanding the most effective ways to help underrepresented and disadvantaged students to access HE and then help them once they enter HE to succeed in it and after it. So in order to understand how to fulfill this mission, we need to produce more causal evidence, which is why TESO's role is to help the sector do this. And if we have more causal evidence, then we'll be able to understand which activities and approaches are the most effective on removing equality gaps. And that's why we need to explore how different methods help basically achieve the outcomes that we're trying to affect. Over time, we want to encourage all programs across the sector to move towards having either type 3 or when it's feasible type 2, and when it's feasible type 3 impact evaluations. However, we are aware that this process might occur over a number of years, especially for really new or complex initiative. And in order to support this change, we have developed a table that summarizes some of the key research methods at each level. And you can download it from our website, and that should help you identify the suitable method that you can use for evaluating your programs. Go on, Ray.
Thanks, Sarah. So I guess moving on to kind of conducting evaluation and into the more detail of how the implementation works. So actually a question we got, I guess, at the very beginning of the evaluation kind of cycle or journey is, how do I access research papers and evidence? And I guess I thought this was an interesting question, especially because not all WP teams, or maybe more specifically teams that sit within sector organizations, so charities or kind of evidence centers, not everyone will have access to academic journals and kind of academic logins, which I think is the assumption in terms of where we access papers and research. So I definitely don't have all the answers, and in fact probably people in the audience will know more than I do, so please do drop kind of suggestions, information in the chat as we go. But I thought I could outline what we do when accessing research and evidence papers. So the key thing here, I think, is to look at a variety of sources and information, especially at the beginning of your search, or when you're trying to understand more about a topic. Maybe you're thinking about how to inform your theory of change. Cast the net quite wide to begin with. So we do use engines like Google Scholar, which is a kind of main source for publication. It has both peer-reviewed journals and non-peer-reviewed journals on there. So you do need to be a little bit discerning in terms of the quality and the methodology used for a research paper, and kind of keep an eye out for those methodologies that are associated with type 2 or type 3 research. So typically making sure that a study has included a kind of comparison or a counterfactual group. Some papers on there are free, but some do sit behind a paywall, which I think is the kind of key barrier and perhaps what drove this question about how do I access papers in research. One thing I would say there is if you have a specific paper or a kind of list of papers and you don't have academic logins or access, I at least would recommend kind of emailing the author, but also checking in with colleagues or friends, peers who work in a similar space. And it might be that people have PDF versions, or very often the author is super happy to share it. So I know Zara does a lot of our kind of evidence synthesis work, and she often emails authors directly, and they're usually super happy to share their research and kind of send you a PDF version of it. So it's worth a try. We do use other databases. So ERIC is one that we've been drawing on recently. I think ERIC stands for Education Resources Information Center, but do fact check me in the chat if that's not correct. And then other official websites. So we rely a lot on Gov data, obviously relevant to HE and education specifically. We also use HESA data quite a lot. Obviously, you can apply for specific HESA data, but they have a huge amount of information just publicly available on their website. The ONS, the Office for National Statistics, also have some useful data and information that you can look at. And then finally, grey literature. So there's a really good kind of quality and standard of what we call grey literature for both national kind of UK and international evidence. So this is things like policy papers, white papers, briefing notes, things that aren't strictly peer reviewed or academic, but also blogs I would put under grey literature. And a lot of universities and HE providers have really excellent blogs where they disseminate the findings of their research and evidence. So can definitely recommend that as well. And then I guess the final thing is just websites from other organizations. So like kind of charity or sector organizations, but also other work centers. I think many of you are probably familiar with the EEF, the Education Endowment Fund, and all of their resources. It's a really good place to go. And then of course, TASO has quite a lot to share as well. So under the publications section on our website, you can find a number of research papers from studies that are complete, but also evidence reviews for each of our themes. So we've got a kind of what works to reduce inequalities specific to outreach and WP. So there's a paper between TASO and the EPI, and we have these sort of evidence reviews across all of our themes, and are actually about to launch a new one for mental health, employability and disability, 3 separate reports. And then finally, the TASO toolkit. Again, this is kind of Zara's little baby and domain, but we have brief and hopefully very easy to kind of understand toolkit pages that take one topic at a time and summarize the evidence according to a bunch of different criteria. So you can find things like the evidence on financial aid, the evidence on summer schools, the evidence on multi-intervention programs, the evidence on learning analytics, and it just gives you a nice brief synopsis and summary. So also a good place to start. I think this is back to Zara for questions around what to do when you can't do an RCT.
Yes, thank you, Rain. So one question that we also often get is people who say, I am unable to randomize my sample, and is there another alternative way to produce causal evaluation? So that comes from the fact that people often think that randomization is the only option when considering causal research methods, but it's not always, obviously randomization is not always possible in the real life context. Sometimes it's not possible for ethical reasons, sometimes it's not possible for methodological reasons. Maybe like the program has started a while ago and the students can no longer be randomized, but we still want to try and get data for type 2 evaluation. So in that case, there are alternative ways of doing impact evaluation. One of them is quasi-experimental designs. It's an empirical study that is used to estimate the causal impact of an evaluation on a target population. without doing this random assignments of units, I guess. In other words, we use what we call QEDs, quasi-experimental designs, to produce a counterfactual, which means what happens when the intervention has not happened, but without doing the random assignment. So 3 methods that that are really common in terms of QEDs are first the propensity score matching. So that's where we use statistical techniques to create an artificial control groups by matching the treated units with non-treated units who have similar characteristics. And that can help us estimate the causal impact of an intervention. The second methodology is the difference in differences. It's where we compare the changes in outcome over time between a population that was enrolled in the program and a population that was not. So we do 2 types of comparisons here: comparison over time and comparison between 2 groups. And the third type of QED that we looked at is regression discontinuity designs. Is where we compare people immediately below and above a cutoff point to identify the impact of a program on a given outcome. So I'm not going to go into lots of details about each of these methodologies right now, but if you are interested in quasi-experimental designs, then I would encourage you to look at a webinar that we did a few months ago, and it should be available on the website. And in this webinar, we cover propensity score matching, difference in difference, and regression discontinuity design. And we also have a recorded Q&A at the end. Now back over to Rain.
Thank you very much. So our next question is, I want to run an RCT, a randomized control trial, but I don't have a large enough sample. What should I do? And I've just seen a question come through in the Q&A that I think is kind of asking or getting at a similar challenge. Needless to say, this is again a very kind of common question or a challenge that we hear a lot. And I think the first thing to ascertain here is, what do we mean by small sample? When is a sample big enough to lend itself well to an RCT, and when is it small enough to lend itself to a kind of more small or specialist methodology? Without getting too caught up in the detail, what we do need to think about here is something called statistical power. And we need to have a sample size that's big enough to give us statistical power if we're thinking about running an RCT or a QED. So we're basically talking about quite large numbers, 200, 300, 400 plus students. When we don't have statistical power and we don't have enough students to use the QED methodologies or the RCT, we look at other methodologies, so methodologies that lend themselves well to small n. So n simply just stands for number of sample size. So when we say small n, we just mean small cohorts. And we have spent the last kind of 12 months or so thinking about this challenge. So often providers are either inherently small, so they're kind of music colleges or veterinary colleges or schools that are only ever going to work with quite small groups of students, or we have larger providers but that want to work with a specific cohort, so perhaps mature learners or students with experience of children's social care, or learners with a disability. Again, groups that might be small in numbers, so 20, 30 students rather than hundreds. And we need to find ways to conduct kind of robust type 2 or type 3 evaluations with these small cohorts and without being able to use the more traditional or more widely known methodologies. So thankfully, there are methodologies available for this. That said, they are new to higher education. So they are used quite a lot in other sectors. I know the international development sector broadly uses these methodologies more often. What you can see on screen here and in the diagram is, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but 2 kind of sections to what we're calling a taxonomy here. So on the left-hand side, you've got something called effects of causes. This is basically the more traditional counterfactual framework. So this is where you will find things like RCTs, randomized control trials, quasi-experiments, everything that Zara just mentioned. Coming to the right-hand side of this taxonomy, we have something called causes of effects, which basically just means that we kind of reverse the logic about trying to understand that causal relationship. So in this example, we we try to understand what the causes are that are kind of pushing an outcome or creating an outcome. And you can see in these kind of in this big grey box, these little black boxes are all the different methodologies that can be used with small cohorts to try and get at that causal link between activity and outcome. What we have here is these kind of 4 highlighted green boxes are methodologies that we're hoping to pilot in the next kind of 6 to 9 months. So we recently put out an open kind of invitation to tender, and we will be shortlisting and selecting a number of HE providers to work with small cohorts to use these methodologies to create causal evaluations. So it's still at the beginning of the journey in terms of conducting the evaluation, but we've definitely made leaps in terms of identifying the methodologies and how we can use and implement them. Which brings me to the evaluation guidance we're going to be producing on this. So for the last year or so, we've been working with MMU, Manchester Metropolitan University, and in June this year, we'll be publishing a suite of guidance for how to conduct evaluation with small cohorts. And there'll be a number of materials. So there'll be a kind of technical report that outlines the theoretical underpinning for what a small cohort is, how we evaluate it, when we evaluate it. We'll then have a series of kind of web pages and downloadable booklets for each of these methodologies to help talk people through how to implement and use them. And we're also over time hoping to add kind of webinars and talking heads and videos that, again, help people engage with and use the evaluation guidance. So it's a little bit of a kind of watch this space answer. We don't have the guidance quite ready to give you in this moment, but it is definitely coming in June. So in kind of 1 or 2 months, it will be available for everyone. So another question we got asked is, how much time should I spend reading and analysing evidence? So again, kind of interesting question, probably a variety of approaches to this. And as always, I do welcome suggestions or comments in the chat if anyone has any bright ideas. But in the meantime, I thought I would talk you through our approach at TASO. So we have a kind of, I guess, a 4-step approach when we are thinking about a new project or a new activity that we want to evaluate or research, and we don't really know what the existing evidence is. We don't know what the landscape looks like in terms of this topic or activity, and sort of, yeah, where do we start and how much time should we spend reading? So the first thing we do is we develop inclusion criteria. And what we mean by this is just the kind of factors that mean that we should or should not include a research paper or a study in our review. So this is things like date of publication. Typically, we try and use evidence since 2010 because there was the kind of fee change that influenced HE and the landscape around HE. We might also think about things like the country that the evidence comes from. Are we open to only UK evidence or also international evidence? So we'll kind of think of a bunch of criteria and then decide whether or not we're going to include that or not in our search to narrow down how much we have to read and how much evidence we want to synthesize. We'll then prioritize this based on a different bunch of criteria. So this is things like type of publication. Are we only interested in meta reviews? Are we also interested in individual studies? Are we interested in grey literature? And again, we'll just have a prioritization exercise there. So what's most important to us all the way down to what's least important. Another thing that we might prioritize on is student life cycle. So are we only interested in the kind of pre-entry, so before someone gets to higher education, or are we only interested in the student journey post-entry, so student success and what happens while they're at university, so on and so forth. The next thing is step 3, search terms. So when we're looking for papers and trying to determine how much to read and how much time to spend reading, we'll think about the key search terms. So, I mean, it could be anything from like outreach, widening participation, learners with disability, mature learners. And of course, we'll think of all the different kind of permutations of that as well when we're looking through Google Scholar or different search engines. And then finally, we will typically use multiple databases. So I mentioned this earlier. We'll look on kind of Google Scholar, ERIC, TNF Online, and also possibly websites from organizations or universities that might have some of that grey literature as well. So this doesn't give you a response in terms of you should spend X amount of time reading, but hopefully if you were to take a process similar to this, you would end up with a smaller selection of papers that you know are important to you based on what you want to understand. And then we would just read until we feel like we're not finding anything new, often a kind of snowball approach within that. So we feel like we've reached almost like a saturation point, I guess, in terms of new information that's coming through or new insight that we're finding. I think that is it. So back to you, Zara.
So once you spend some time reading and analyzing the evidence, you might also want to do some data analysis. And in that case, one question that we often get is, what software or tool should I use for data analysis? And thankfully, there are multiple options that you can pick for data analysis. So I'm going to go over the most common ones, but there are others actually. So first of all, starting with the one that we are using at DASO, RStudio or R. So it's an open source programming language, meaning that it's free to download. It's specifically built for data analysis and visualization. So it's traditionally used by statisticians and academic researchers, and it allows users to really use cutting edge statistical methods, which is really useful when you want to do evaluation. And it's basically built by users. So it has over 15,000 packages that are available for loading, manipulating, modeling, and visualizing data. And you can just download the packages that you need for your own analysis. However, the main drawback is that it does have an entry cost, so it does require some technical programming skills in order to use it properly and to be able to do the analysis. But there are a lot of free online resources that you can use to learn how to use R. And also when you're stuck on something, you can go to different forums that will probably have answers on your issues with R. The second most commonly used data analysis method software, I guess, especially in the social policy higher education sector, is Stata. So unlike R, Stata does have a cost. The cost depends on the number of licenses and also the type of organization requesting the licenses. But compared to R and also to Python that I will present afterwards, it's easier to learn. So it might be suitable for someone who has less to no coding experience. And it does have community support and also official learning material that can be used for learning the language. The third option would be Python. So it's just like R, it's open source, so it's a free software to download. And it's also one of the most popular programming languages overall. So not just in the social, in the policy evaluation sector, but also beyond it. And it's a general purpose programming language, so it can be used to make a lot of different things. So it's also used for AI, it's used for data analysis, but really it's maybe the most broadly reaching language that you can use for data analysis. However, it does require a lot of expertise and it's more technical than Stata or even R. So if you do want to learn Python, you will probably have to, once again, like train quite a lot. And it doesn't just have statistical methods, so it might be a bit more confusing compared to R, who is like more specialized in analyzing data. However, if you are interested in like other programming, I guess, programming objectives, then maybe learning Python might be better for you because then you can use it for everything. Another piece of software that is obviously the most well-known is Excel. So it's a common tool that you can use for manipulating spreadsheets and also analyzing them. And it's suitable for simple analysis, but it might not be suitable for analyzing big data and also doing more complex statistical analysis. that you might need for example, an RCT. So I would say it's more of a complementary method that you can use. And finally, there is a software called Spss. It's a software that's owned by an IBM, and it also is a private one, so you do have to pay for it. And the prices start around 800 euros. A bit like Stata, it's pretty easy to learn, and it has a pretty user-friendly interface, but it has less options for more advanced and personalized data visualization. And it also has less documentation than Stata or R or Python, just because it has fewer users. So at the end, the software that you want to use is really dependent on what your needs are and what your ambitions are. So at TESO, we do use R because we believe that it's a nice balance between, first, it's free. Also, it allows us to do the analysis that we want to do, and we are ready to like train a little bit to understand how to use it correctly. But maybe for you, it will be easier to use Stata, or maybe you want to use Python. And yeah, after this session, we'll provide summary table that will give you all these elements, and then you can decide which software you think might be better for you. Another question is, so if you are conducting an evaluation of an outreach program, but you don't know which survey scales to use for intermediate outcomes, we do recognize that it's a long and complicated process to construct and test validated scales. And that's why TESO is currently working on developing those a few bespoke and validated scales for intermediate outcomes that are relevant to the HE sector. But in the meantime, there are some things that you can do. First of all, when possible, it's better to use pre-existing validated scales. So you can find them by going through the evidence and looking at maybe research articles that validate those scales or use these scales, explaining that they have been validated. When you do use these scales, you can make modest changes to the wording and the structure of the scales, and that will help you improve their usability in your context. And obviously, when there is where there is existing data from the scales that have already been used, it's possible to test the reliability and validity. And actually, if you want to learn more on that, we have a webinar on survey design with the methods that you can use to assess the reliability and validity. So we also have resources to help with survey design in general on our website. So we have a page on designing Likert scales. We have this webinar on survey design and validation. And soon we'll have the bespoke WP survey scales that hopefully will be very useful for your analysis. Now over to Rain.
Diving for the unmute button. Thank you, Zara. So the next question is incredibly common. I would go as far as say this is maybe one of the ones we hear most frequently. So I'm doing a study with entry to higher education as the primary outcome, and the HESA data won't be available for years to come. How can I measure impact in the meantime? This is also very salient for us at TESO. So a lot of the evaluations that we're currently running are reliant on HESA data to be able to measure the final impact, the kind of primary outcome. And I think for studies that we have going at the moment, we're not going to get that data till 2023 and sometimes 2024. So it's definitely a real challenge. So I think I've kind of got two things to say here, or two kind of recommendations. Number one is think about what the intermediate outcomes could be, or the proxy measures for your final outcome data. So where we have an activity on the left, perhaps that's a summer school or a multi-intervention outreach program, and we have our final outcome or our primary data on the right, and that might be HESA data, which tells us whether or not the student entered HE. Let's think about what we can measure in the meantime. So what are proxy measures for entry to HE? And there's a wide range of things that we can include here. There's kind of psychosocial constructs, so things like confidence, academic self-efficacy, whether or not attainment, whether or not someone believes that they can get into university, so things like expectations to get into university or higher education. So we can use survey scales to measure that, and it's self-report. We ask students in the meantime whether or not their kind of confidence has changed from baseline to midline, and this gives us some indication of how the intervention is working, or whether or not the intervention is working at all, while we wait for that outcome data. Zara has already mentioned this, but TASO is currently working on a sort of WP, so widening participation and student success specific survey questionnaire. So we recognize that there isn't currently a uniform way to measure things like confidence, self-efficacy, growth mindset across everyone. And often people are pulling validated scales from other contexts and changing the wording or creating our own scales. And there's a kind of lack of robustness in those scales, but also in the way that we can generalize across the sector if we're all using slightly different versions. So we're working with the Brilliant Club and researchers from the University of Cambridge at the moment to try and fix that challenge by producing a bunch of survey scales that the whole sector can then use and that will be fully validated. And I'm really hoping that that will help with this intermediate outcome question. So what are the proxy measures while we wait for HESA data? The second thing that I'll mention here is UCAS strobe data. Complete transparency and caveat, we're actually at the beginning of our journey with using this, so I haven't been through all of the motions or steps yet, and can definitely report back once I have, or happy to kind of have a follow-up conversation with anyone that's interested to use strobe. But what UCAS strobe does is it allows us to access information or data on whether or not students have applied to higher education before the HESA data comes out. So it gives us the information a little bit earlier than we'll get it from HESA. And what we can do as researchers or evaluators or practitioners working with students is take a cohort that we're interested in, so perhaps a cohort that we have been working on a summer school with, and request information for that cohort from UCAS strobe, so from the UCAS service, and they are able to give us back anonymized data for that cohort, and that can tell us at the kind of aggregate meta level a bunch of information, so whether or not, or what percentage or how many students applied to UCAS, whether or not offers have been made by HE providers, whether or not offers have been accepted by students, and if so, the nature of the kind of course or like the kind of either the course or the subject area that they've gone into. So it's, again, because it's aggregate and because it's anonymous, it's not as accurate as HESA data, but it does give us a really nice proxy while we wait for that HESA outcome. So it's another option to look at, basically. And perhaps we'll do another session once we've been through the full process and understand it in more detail. I think this is back to Zara.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about some questions that you can have after the evaluation. One important one is what to do with the null results. So first of all, you need to understand what is a null result. It's a result that doesn't show statistically significant outcomes between the conditions. It doesn't mean that the intervention didn't have any effect or that the evaluation was necessarily badly done, but just that the variation that we observed was not large enough to stand out, given the characteristic of the experiments. And this can happen for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's really important to understand that no results are not meaningless or they are not failures. Actually, they are more common than we think, and they can provide useful information. So what should you do when you have a null result? First of all, you should congratulate yourself. I know it might be counterintuitive to say that, but actually getting a null result means that you've completed an impact evaluation. And it's really not an easy process, as we know really well at TASO. And so even if the results are not the ones that you were expecting or hoping for, it's still very important that you've committed to doing type 3 evaluation and you have completed the process and you've come with results, even if there are no results. Secondly, you need to reflect on your experiment. So you need to try and understand why there are no results. And that will come with analyzing the characteristics of your evaluation. So what was your sample size? Maybe your sample size was too small, which happens a lot, and it's not really a failure, it just happens for many reasons. So maybe your sample size was too small to detect statistically significant effects. Maybe the outcome measures were not the right ones. So maybe you thought that your intervention would affect X, Y, Z, but actually it's not that easy. And maybe it affects other interesting outcome measures, but you just haven't thought of measuring those ones. And it can also be due to the intervention itself. So maybe the intervention itself is not strong enough. Maybe there can be many reasons why there will be no results, but it's really interesting for you to reflect on why that can be the case, because then it can help you inform practice, but it can also help you inform further evaluation if you want to maybe start another evaluation of the same program or evaluate another program in the future. And finally, you should share knowledge. So I know it's like, once again, a bit counterintuitive and something that researchers have not been doing enough in the last years, but you should really share your results, your null results, in the same way that you will share statistically significant results, even if researchers tend to just keep it for themselves. It's actually really interesting to know that something is not statistically significant, because it can help inform practice, and it can also inform future research on the topic. Now I will hand on to Rain for the last question.
Thank you, Zara. So here we have a question. I have evaluation findings that I believe could be of interest to the rest of the sector. How do I disseminate these findings? Again, as you can imagine, a challenge that lots of people face. So I think the thing that we always kind of advocate for here is that obviously doing the research and doing the evaluation is super important and kind of no easy feat, and definitely the first step, but it is super important that we share those findings. And I think the example that I often give here when having conversations with different practitioners or evaluators is the example of the treatment for scurvy, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but James Lind, who was a kind of doctor, was the first person to discover the treatment or the cure for scurvy. And from the time of discovering that cure, it took 50 years to be able to widely disseminate or help other doctors and other kind of Royal Navy feats understand that cure and roll it out. So I think it just nicely kind of depicts or illustrates how having the information or knowing what the cure is, knowing how to get people into higher education, knowing how to best support and help underrepresented students is excellent, and it's definitely the first difficult step, but we really need to be able to share that knowledge so we don't have a kind of 50-year delay between the rest of the sector or the rest of people benefiting from that finding. So I think these are probably quite intuitive and quite straightforward solutions or suggestions, and it's again kind of just sharing what we do at TASO or what our approach is. I think the first thing, where possible, simplify your findings, not so much that you lose the rigor or lose the kind of key information, but if you can, create a PowerPoint, create a briefing note, make it easy to understand and easier to disseminate to larger and wider audiences outside of your specific kind of team or your specific research consortium. Publish the paper on your website if you can. So I know it takes quite a bit of extra resource to write up your research and evaluation findings, especially into a format that feels kind of publicly available and happy to share with the wider sector. But often what we hear is that people have done interesting evaluations or they've done some really interesting research, but it's still sitting on shared drives in a kind of 80% complete format where they know what they found and they have the information they need. Yeah, where possible, but absolutely understanding the difficulties around resource, if we can just get that extra 20% over the line and write it up into something that can just be put on your website, that is hugely beneficial for people that are looking for grey literature and looking for emerging findings through Google. Apply to speak at external conferences, sector networking events, regional meetings. We often see, a variety of things from more formal conferences all the way through to kind of evaluation networks popping up in different regions with different universities. And put yourself out there, I guess, send an email, say that you've got this new finding, you're really interested to share it. I often have some of the most kind of interesting or illuminating conversations in those kind of events where someone's saying, we've been running this reading program for 3 years. We really think it's working. We've been evaluating it like this, but I haven't heard of it because I can't find it when I turn to Google or different search engines. Finally, share it with Tazo. We're definitely still trying to come up with a better way for this kind of knowledge sharing and information sharing task. And I think Tazo is probably quite well placed to be a central body that people can kind of give to, and also then we can give back to. The toolkit is one way of doing that, but if you have something that you think is of interest to either a kind of toolkit page, maybe a new toolkit page or a theme we're working on, share it with us. You can either send it to the kind of general info@Tazo or research@Tazo account. And yeah, we're also always interested to hear from others. So I think that's bringing us to the end of the kind of questions that people sent through in advance. A few other things to note: there is a kind of increasing bunch of evaluation guidance on our website. So we have something that we call the Monitoring and Evaluation Framework, which sets out 4 key stages in evaluation. So that's the kind of diagnose, the plan, the measure, and reflect phases. And on our website, there's a lot of information and also pre-recorded webinars on what to do in each of those phases. So do check it out if you haven't already. And then we also have an Unlocking Effective Evaluation webinar series that we have been running recently. The topics we covered are things like the difference between causation and correlation, how to run a theory of change workshop and develop a theory of change, survey design and validation. So what to do, how to design surveys, how to validate survey scales, pre and post test designs, exactly what it says on the tin really, but there's a pre-recorded webinar that talks you through that. And then quasi-experimental designs and RCTs are also there. Again, if you have topics or different methodologies that you'd like us to cover and talk about in the future, do let us know. Either email one of the Tazo accounts, and we're hoping to kind of continue this series and continue to support the sector and provide the relevant information on the questions that you have. But for now, we have got some time to continue this kind of discussion and conversation. It's a shame that it's a webinar format and we can't kind of see and hear you, but please do use the chat function, and Zara and I, Helen and I, will try and answer as many questions as we can.
Thank you very much indeed, Rain and Zara. That was a very, very interesting and very, very illuminating question time on some of the questions around challenges for evaluation. We do have some comments and questions. The first is a comment, and then we've also had a question which actually links quite nicely to the comment. The comment is that smaller institutions often don't have evaluation teams as such. Often it's just one person covering the evaluation of access, attainment, continuation, and progression. The alternative methods are generally quite time resource intensive, and therefore, if there's only one person doing the evaluation, there's often only one person doing the evaluation for the whole institution, which I think perhaps sort of ties into some of the small n and the other methods that can be used for the small n work. But sort of linked to that as well as the is a question, and this person says, I'm part of a very small team running several projects with WP students. I think we need to start doing more evaluation of our work, but everyone's so busy, it's never seen as a priority. Is there anything I can do to build support in my team for doing evaluation and move it to the top of people's priority lists?
I can start here, and then Zara, do feel free to jump in. Yeah, I guess I really hear the challenge, and probably not surprising that it is something that comes up quite a lot. I think the first thing to think about here is helping or providing space for people to unpick or understand what the barriers are. So where evaluation doesn't seem a priority, let's let's really probe into why and what are those barriers. And I know we often hear kind of resourcing, time, they're definite barriers. But what are the other barriers? Is there, I mean, my assumptions, and they are assumptions, would be there's a kind of lack of understanding for the role that evaluation plays, and specifically the kind of causal evidence and how important that can be for budgeting our time and resource and people power in the future. Is it that people there's almost like a disconnect between delivery teams and those who are seeing the impact of activities play out, and then those who are making decisions on resourcing? So perhaps we need to try to kind of close that gap a little bit, and again, just create time and space to listen to and talk to each other. So yeah, I think number one is understanding the barriers, and then obviously once we have a clear idea of barriers, what are the solutions to those barriers? And Tezo, we're obviously very interested in this, and we are actually going to be conducting a piece of research over the summer to try and understand these barriers in more detail, so that we can have a kind of a key steer or direction for how we overcome them. But the things that we're thinking at the moment is to provide more kind of research grants and funding for people to be able to get involved in projects. So what our model has been at the moment is that if we're running an evaluation, or for instance, the small N work that we're doing, that we put out small research grants and that people can apply to be part of those. So essentially you would have a funding pot that you can then use to either bring in, I mean, it's up to the provider to decide how they use it, but either you can bring in external help from research assistants or kind of new expertise, or you can use it to upskill and train your current team so that stays within your core team. I think that's one thing, kind of more research grant funding made available. Bigger timelines is another thing we're really working on. So can we make evaluation happen over a longer time series, so that we're not trying to kind of squeeze things into 6 or 12 months and then come up with the answers really quickly. We're not quite there yet, but it's definitely on our radar and on our agenda. And then I think there is something around allowing the learning process to happen and recognizing that that takes time. So we're trying to do more and more of these kind of sessions and the unlocking effective evaluation sessions to help people really understand in quite practical and theoretical terms the role that evaluation does play, and actually how important it is for longer term, more sustainable decisions around the activities that we're delivering and the impact that those activities have for young people. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but Zara, do jump in if you have anything else you'd add.
I think it's a very thorough answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Rain. That was very, very helpful. Thank you. This is a slightly more technical question. Is it possible to use non-parametric statistics as an alternative where sample sizes are on the lower side?
Absolutely. I'm not sure if this question came in before or after we spoke about the small cohorts work, and I showed that kind of taxonomy on the slide, where we have sort of counterfactual methodologies on the left and non-counterfactual methodologies on the right. And those methodologies that are well suited to small cohorts do include non-parametric tests. And there are, I mean, some of them are parametric and some aren't, but there's about 8 methodologies that we've identified that are particularly well suited to small n. And within that, a range of different approaches and methodologies are used. So I don't think now is the best time to go into all of the detail, although I guess I could, but broadly, we're thinking about things like kind of semi-structured interviews and qualitative work, all the way through to kind of documentation review, monitoring data, monitoring information, and then fitting that into a number of kind of, I guess, quite a range or a distribution of statistical methodologies and approaches. So there is a solution for non-parametric tests with small cohorts. Again, it's a little bit frustrating to use the kind of watch this space, but there will absolutely be more information coming on this. And if you have kind of questions in the meantime, then again, do get in touch, drop us an email. Always happy to chat further on it.
Great, thank you, Rain. I think this might be another watch this space. Can you give some advice around how to evaluate attainment, given the increased focus on attainment raising initiatives, especially if we're not able to rely on schools for that information?
Yeah, sure. So try and keep this brief and to the point. So Taser are doing some thinking on this at the moment, as you can imagine, the kind of post John Blake announcement and the push for attainment. So I think my key 3 headlines are where we can't access attainment data or there's a delay for attainment data, let's look at proxy measures or intermediate outcomes. We mentioned this previously, and there are a number of kind of psychosocial constructs that are very highly correlated with attainment. So these are things like academic self-efficacy, metacognition, growth mindset to some degree is correlated with academic attainment. And what I say when kind of associated or correlated just means that a lot of the variance in whether or not someone attends higher education is explained by attainment. So with attainment is the kind of largest or biggest predictor of whether or not someone ends up in HE. And of that attainment, these psychosocial constructs, so academic self-efficacy as an example, accounts for a lot of the variance in how someone scores on a test, so what their attainment is. And so it's really just like the middle measure that we can use while we're waiting for actual attainment data. So use intermediate outcomes. I think the survey validation work that we're doing is really going to try and plug that gap. So we'll be producing survey scales for the sector so that you can measure things like confidence, self-efficacy in a robust way that has been validated in the UK context with UK WP students and UK kind of underrepresented students from different samples. Number 2, where you can't access attainment data because it sits or exists within schools, HEAT are starting to play a really important role here. So I don't know the higher education access tracker or attainment tracker. Some of you may know HEAT or maybe members of HEAT, but they have recently launched something called a Key Stage 4 platform, where you can now track the Key Stage 4 attainment for students that you've worked with. So you can either do that for your students and then compare them to the national pupil database, so a kind of similar population, or if you have a treatment and control group, so you've set up a kind of trial or some kind of comparator group, you can track both of those students, both of those groups of students in HEAT, and you can compare Key Stage 4 for the treatment group to Key Stage 4 for the control group. This is a huge development. It's been a real challenge for universities to access kind of school level attainment data and to navigate the national pupil database. And being able to do that through HEAT, I hope, is going to make a really big difference as part of this push for kind of attainment raising activity. And I think my third point here was just going to be that we also, I'm aware that we need to tie this conversation in with the Office for Students, the OFS. And at the moment, I'm hoping to kind of loop them in and speak to them, particularly about these intermediate outcomes, for instance. So if I was a higher education provider and I was going to try to increase attainment or raise attainment, and there was going to be a long delay or I wasn't able to access actual attainment data, what I would want to know is whether or not the OFS would accept these intermediate outcomes in my access and participation plan. And I'm hoping to get clarification on that from the OFS in the future, in the kind of, in the next month, really. And then the final thing to say, sorry, I'm not keeping this brief at all, is that we will run a webinar on attainment raising in the next couple of months as well, and hoping to loop HEAT into that so that we can give you a kind of package of here is how we evaluate attainment. Sorry, Helen.
Brilliant. That's fine. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rain. Another question here. Can you recommend any good resources such as books, websites, journal articles, which would provide an introduction and or overview of impact evaluation?
I can take this one if you want, Rain, so you can rest a little bit. Yeah, so we do, every time we do this kind of webinar, we send a list of resources that are relevant to the session that we did. So if you look at like our previous sessions, then you can find a list of resources that's relevant to them. And also we obviously have our own material that we believe is somehow accessible to people who just start evaluation. But we are always aiming to create more material that can be used at different levels. So people who are very new to evaluation, to people who have a bit more experience. So if you have an interest for specific topics that you want to cover, do just let us know. And also we always try to share relevant resources from other organizations. So I would say it's a mix of looking for material online and also letting us know and looking at the material that we are providing.
Lee.
Rain, do you want to add anything?
Thank you, Zara. Another question here. This is on the survey and the survey scales. The question is this just for access work, or can they be used for success and progression as well?
Great question. I can start this. We are hoping it's gonna span both. So we're kind of at the, sorry, I should say that it's a 12-month project and we're about 5 months in. So we've got a kind of draft list of constructs that we're hoping to cover, and we're about to start cognitive testing to develop those scales alongside students. And we, of all the constructs we are covering, we're hoping at least to cover pre-entry, so access and success. My sense is that it's going to be a bit more weighted to the access side, but we will have things like sense of belonging, so post-entry sense of belonging once someone is at university, to what degree do they feel like they belong, and historically there hasn't been a super robust way to measure this. And then with that, things like academics, self-efficacy, so post-entry student success, self-efficacy, and confidence. So the short answer is it will span both, but I think at the moment it's slightly weighted towards the access side as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rain. Another comment and question here. We're just writing up the results of one of our interventions, and it's looking like it's had a negative impact on some students. We've also heard rumours that lecturers aren't happy with us because of this. Is there anything that Taser can suggest that we do to turn this into something constructive? And also, are there things that you think we need to watch out for to try and avoid implementing interventions that don't work?
I can, Rain, you can take the beginning of the question. I just had a thought about the end. I think if you want to, I mean, you can never avoid doing an intervention that might have negative impact, because you never know before you tried it. However, looking at evidence that has already been produced on the topic can help a lot. So really doing a thorough literature review beforehand, making sure that there are that if possible, the intervention that you're going to try and implement has some positive evaluation already done on like maybe other contexts, but as close as possible to your actual context. However, yeah, you can never make sure that it's not going to not be efficient, but this can help.
Thank you, Zara.
I think that's, yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add there.
We just had a question about the small N pilot project. Can providers still sign up for this, or is it closed?
Unfortunately, it is closed. Yeah, sadly, it is closed. But we're going to be conducting 4 pilots as part of this kind of current cohort, and my hope is that we can continue to do that into the next year. So this will be kind of 2023 with different methodologies. But yeah, sadly, it is closed this time around. The only thing I would say on that is that although we won't be putting out kind of research grants for pilots again this year, the same guidance and the same information will be available to everyone. And I'm very happy to have a kind of a sort of once-off 30-minute call and help people understand the guidance if that's useful. But to be part of the overall project is sadly closed. Okay,
thank you. So this is a comment, quite a long comment, but I think an interesting one, and you may want to comment back. Discerning what pieces of work need more extensive evaluations is important. Some activities are inherently not as measurable, impactful as others, and trying to do course evaluations for all activity isn't necessarily needed or indeed possible, especially with small teams, really one person doing all the evaluation. Identifying throughout the year the key activity where you can do longer and more in-depth evaluations might be helpful, I'm just thinking that people might think that they need to do this kind of level evaluation for all of their activities. I don't know whether you'd like to pick anything up.
Well, firstly to say I absolutely agree. I think they're really astute observations. And I guess the thing that chimes most with me is this idea of longer term and more in-depth evaluations. I agree. I really advocate for that. And yeah, it's certainly something that's kind of on Tazo's agenda in terms of thinking through how we can ensure we have longevity in our evaluations and are able to observe these changes over time. Not least because I think it takes an enormous amount of capacity and resource to set up an evaluation, often as long as it does to actually conduct the evaluation. And so I think increasing the time would be really useful, but completely agree with this comment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rain. Thank you, Zara. That's it for comments and questions. So I'll just say, unless anyone has got anything burning that they would like to say, that they would like to add, then now is your opportunity. But if not, just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed, everyone, for joining us. Oh, I do apologize. I've just looked in the chat. There's a comment here. Well, this is, I don't know whether you can see it, about learning our there's a number of learning texts available as well, so you can also interface to R for Python from within Microsoft Power BI. I'd also like to caution that non-statisticians can easily use the wrong tool and or simply not understand the outputs. Hope this helps.
I will pick up on that really briefly. I think, yeah, Power BI is a really cool data visualization tool, which is one we didn't mention actually. So that's another one to check out, although it serves a slightly different purpose. I'm very happy to share it's an internal, quite messy document that we've been just keeping tabs on all the R resources that we have found useful. It's something that we use within our internal team. It's kind of pre-recorded lectures, webinars, links to things like the Tidyverse and free online courses, some of which are really useful. I've completely learned from Google, from the web, and it does work quite well. So super happy to, it's not kind of confidential or personal anyway, very happy to hand that out. Again, just get in touch via email if it would be useful. It's just a Word doc with various things that we can share with you.
Great. Thank you, Rain. Okay, I think that's it. So yeah, last minute questions. Don't think so. Comments. So yes, thank you very much indeed to everyone that attended our webinar today, and I really hope that you found it helpful. And thank you too to Rain and Zara for leading the questions and answering those questions so well, considering that when you're taking things on the hop like this. So that was brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And yes, some good comments coming through. Resource would be helpful, and thank you for the session. So thank you very much indeed, everyone.
Thank
and
you.
hopefully see you at another one of our sessions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.